In this tutorial, we're going to render an animation using the UTSOA Renderfarm. So real quickly, I already in this scene have a camera set up, so I basically just drew a line and made this vertice smooth by right-clicking and saying make smooth, and that way I've made a path for this camera. So the next thing you need to do is just make sure you have a camera. This is a target camera, just a standard one. The target's here, and then to attach it to this path you just select the camera and go to animation, constraints, and do path constraint, and then select the path. Now if I move along this timeline, you can see my camera is actually following the path. And then if I go into my camera view, you can preview it just by hitting play over here, and that's the animation that I want to render. So there's just a few things you need to set up. The first thing is you want to make sure your file is saved to the render farm, so you want to make sure you're in your folder and the file saved there. You also want to make sure all your maps, so any kind of bitmap that you have in the scene, no matter what it is, as long as you also want to make sure HDRI, but any kind of bitmap or HDRI, well, double click and make sure that's linked to the maps folder on the network, otherwise it won't work. Okay, so once you have all that set up, you can go to the render tab. Just let this process real quick. So you go to rendering, render setup. There's a few things you need to do. We're going to render an animation, but the first step, you actually want to keep this as single. So typically it'll be animation, but we want to make sure this is single right here. And then you also want to choose an output size. I think 1280 by 720 is a good output size. You don't want to render it too big because you'll be projecting this on a screen, and also for render time you want it to be fairly small but not too small. So I think 1280 by 720 is a pretty good amount. You want to make sure that's not selected. And then under VRay, the first thing you want to do is go to global switches and hit this don't render final image. So we're going to render light maps before we actually render the final image. So go ahead and hit that. And then go indirect illumination. We're going to render the light cache first. So make both of the, under GI, make both of the GI engines light cache. And then make sure your light cache is set relatively good. So 2500 by 0.01 is pretty good. And then the next thing we want to check is the mode. We're going to render a fly-through. So this will render our light map for the entire animation. And then we want to make sure on render in that we save this file. So you want to browse, go to your network drive, and then just save it as some kind of name, and it's going to save it as a light cache map. Okay, and that's the last thing that you need to select there. So once you're set, you can save this. You don't want to have any of this. You could turn all this off. That's okay. You don't want to save anything. The one thing you have to do under VRay buffer is just save some kind of, you could turn this one off, but let's just save some kind of default test or trash animation. So you could just save that as whatever you want to save it as, and then go ahead and save that to the network. Save that file. Okay, once you've saved your file to the render farm, you can go ahead and hit rrender submit scene, and it's going to go ahead and go through the motions here. Open up Royal Render. Okay, and then once it brings up the browser, you can select your camera view that you're going to render. And now this is really important. We're going to use 16 gig machines, and then you can use smaller ones if your scene's pretty small, but for these complex ones you want to use a 16 gig machine. And then the key is you only want to select one computer. So that's really important because it's going to render the entire map on one computer. And then you can assign that particular computer, and you do not want to tile this one because it's going to create the entire map just using the one computer. And then everything else should be fine. So once you've done that, you can submit the job. And then once you submit it, you can close the Royal Render. Okay, so back in Max, you've now rendered the light cache map, but now we need to render the Radiance map. So go ahead and open up Render Setup again. Go to the Common tab. This time we want to choose Active Time Segment, and we want to render every 5th frame. So we don't want to render every frame, just every 5th frame. Keep all this the same. Go to VRay. Again, you want to make sure under global settings, let's see, so right here you want to make sure you keep that the same. You could change this name. You can delete this later. You want to make sure that don't render final image is selected. And then let's go to indirect illumination. So in this case, we're actually going to render the Radiance Map. And we can keep the light cache as it is for now. So the Radiance Map, go ahead and select from the drop down here, medium animation. If you have time, you can render high animation, but you want to use at least one of these animation types. And then down a little lower under mode, we're going to do multi-frame incremental. And then a little lower under autosave, you want to make sure you save this map. Again, you want to save this to your network folder under animation and save it as a file name, and this will save the Radiance Map file. The next thing you want to do a little bit down under light cache, so that's under the Radiance, and then under light cache, since we already rendered this file, we can select from the drop down from file and then browse our network and then select that VRL map, the light cache map that we had already rendered. So it'll just use that data when it renders this Radiance map. So that should be all we need to do now for this one. So go ahead and save this file. So once again, save and make sure it's saving to your network folder. And then go ahead and resubmit the scene to, and I'm going to say yes because I haven't saved this yet, resubmit it to the render farm. Okay, once the render farm opens up, again you want to select the camera, and once again you only want to select one of these machines. I'm going to select 16 gigabyte machines, select one of these machines, assign that machine, and again you do not want to tile. And then once you have those settings, go ahead and submit the job. Okay, and once you submit the job, you're ready to render your final animation. So go ahead and go back to rendering, render setup. There's a few things we need to change. Under the common tab, we now want to render active time segment and render every frame, so make sure you make that 1. Keep all of this the same. The next thing you want to do is go to VRay, and under frame buffer, you want to make sure you're saving these as EXR file types, so this can be your final render, so you can rename this one. Again, save it to your network folder. You also want to save your material ID channel. So remember, this is the material ID, so if you double click on a material, you want to make sure all your objects have different material IDs. And then under render elements, you want to make sure render elements are active. So that, but don't have this selected, just make it here. And then go to VRay, VRay frame buffer. And then under here you can do the render channel. So if you browse and go to your network and then go to where you want to save this, I guess I'll save this to stills, you want to make sure you're using EXR file type. And when you use EXR file type, and you hit save, this pop-up will appear, and then you can add and add the VRay material ID, and then say OK. The next thing you want to change is under global switches. You want to make sure this is deselected, so you don't want to have that selected because this time you want to render the final image. And then the last thing you want to do is go back to a Radiance Map. So under a Radiance Map, you've already rendered this file out, so you can go to From File, and then you can browse and find that file in your network drive. So you'll be using the Radiance Map file that you've already rendered out, and you'll be using the light cache file that you've already rendered out. Aside from that, you might want to make sure your memory limit is pretty high, so I have mine set at 4,000. It should be fine for basic animations, but it's just kind of a good test. And then everything's to go, so you can now save that file and resubmit this scene to the render farm. Okay, and then once the render farm comes up, again you want to select the camera. You want to go to 16 gigabytes, and in this case you can select all of the computers or whichever ones you want, assign all of them. Again, you do not want to tile, just render one at a time, and that should be it. So once you've got all these settings set, you can then submit that job and it will render your animation.